Welcome, viewers. You are about to hear a captivating tale written and narrated by me, Vincent Gray, exclusively for the Detective Chronicles channel. In this story, a legendary artifact, a dark conspiracy, and a mystery that's deeper than it first appears will keep you on the edge of your seat. Don't forget to subscribe, for what begins as a simple theft may unravel secrets that could change everything. Vincent Gray, Sherlock Holmes, The Curse of the Golden Lion. Sherlock Holmes strode purposefully through the grand entrance of the British Museum, the soft echo of his boots reverberating against the marble floors. The high-ceilinged foyer, with its lofty arches and towering columns, seemed to swallow the bustling sounds of the crowd around him, leaving only a sense of quiet anticipation. Holmes's sharp eyes took in every detail, the flickering gaslights casting long shadows across the polished stone, the murmurs of visitors lost in the awe of history, and the faint, ever-present scent of ancient dust that hung in the air like a memory of forgotten eras. Beside him, his loyal companion, Dr. John Watson, walked with a calm composure, though Holmes could sense the slight tension in his friend's gait. Watson, ever the optimist, had been curious about the artifact that had drawn them here, the Golden Lion, an ancient relic of uncertain origins, its origins steeped in myth and legend. As the two men made their way through the winding corridors, their path was illuminated by the soft glow of lamps and the occasional reflection of the polished marble floors. "There's something about this place, Watson," Holmes murmured, his voice low but carrying a weight of thought. He paused to study a display case, his hands clasped behind his back, the familiar tilt of his head suggesting deep contemplation. History, after all, is nothing more than a collection of facts that we choose to ignore until they present themselves once more, like an old friend who knocks on our door uninvited. Watson's gaze shifted toward the numerous artifacts lining the walls, each one a testament to mankind's ceaseless search for knowledge and power. And yet, we seem to repeat our mistakes, don't we? Take this Golden Lion, for instance. Its curse is the talk of the town. Holmes didn't respond immediately, his eyes narrowing as he absorbed the many whispers of the room. The Golden Lion, housed within a grand glass display case in the museum's ancient exhibit hall, gleamed under the lights, its polished surface reflecting the faces of the onlookers who gazed at it with both reverence and trepidation. Some whispered about the supposed curse, an ominous tale of misfortune and death that had followed the artifact for centuries. Holmes was not easily swayed by superstition, though. To him, the curse was a veil of conjecture, a fabrication woven around the lion's enigmatic past. As his sharp mind worked, he saw beyond the folklore. He saw only the object, the material. The object that had drawn a number of wealthy patrons and scholars to this very hall, each with their own reasons for its acquisition. "It is fascinating, Watson," Holmes said, shifting his gaze to the lion. "How easily people succumb to the allure of the unknown, believing in a myth when the facts themselves are far more interesting." Watson, who had often been the more pragmatic of the two, raised an eyebrow, but his attention was caught by the anxious glance of a nearby museum curator, Professor Williams, who was standing just to the side, speaking with a group of scholars. He seemed on edge, casting furtive glances at the Golden Lion. Watson could not help but wonder if it was the weight of the artifact's history that had him so unsettled, or something else entirely. Holmes's eyes followed Watson's gaze, his perceptiveness sharper than ever. He observed the professor's manner, tight, nervous, and perhaps just a touch too eager to dismiss any talk of the curse. "Ah, there he is," Holmes said with a knowing smile, turning toward Watson. "Professor Williams, the curator of the exhibit, an old acquaintance of mine. Shall we pay him a visit?" Watson nodded, intrigued by Holmes's sudden interest. As the two made their way toward the professor, the crowd parted slightly, allowing them a clear path to the man who had spent years studying the very object now the subject of so much speculation. "Holmes, Watson," Professor Williams greeted them, his tone professional but with a noticeable edge. "I trust you are finding the exhibit to your liking." "Fascinating," Holmes replied with his usual directness, though his tone was laced with a hint of curiosity. "The lion in particular. It's quite a marvel, wouldn't you say? a relic of such great significance. "Ah, yes," Professor Williams responded quickly, his eyes flicking nervously toward the artifact. "But I must assure you, gentlemen, the curse is nothing more than superstition. Pure fiction, I assure you." Holmes studied him closely, his eyes narrowing slightly as he examined the professor's posture, the slight tremor in his voice, and the way his hand hovered near his waist, as though itching for something to grasp. "Indeed," Holmes replied coolly, his gaze never wavering from Williams. "Yet I cannot help but notice the unease in your eyes, Professor. Perhaps it is not the curse that troubles you, but something else entirely." Watson, ever the practical one, stepped forward to ease the tension. "Surely, you must have more than just tales to rely on. After all, you've spent years curating this collection. I'm sure you've come to understand these artifacts on a much deeper level." Williams glanced nervously around before leaning closer, his voice dropping to a near whisper. I've seen things, gentlemen. Strange occurrences, accidents, visitors who've fallen ill, employees who've gone missing. He swallowed hard, as if the words themselves threatened to choke him. "I don't wish to be seen as a fool, but there is something about that lion. Something wrong." Holmes stood silent for a moment, his eyes never leaving the professor, but his mind already working, piecing together the subtle clues of William's behavior. "Tell me, Professor," Holmes said softly, "how long have you been curator of this exhibit?" 6 years, Williams answered quickly, a hint of defensiveness creeping into his voice. "And I've never encountered anything like this before. But now that the lion is here, there's been strange happenings." Watson exchanged a glance with Holmes, a silent communication passing between them. The professor's obvious discomfort was not lost on either of them. "Well, we certainly wouldn't want to suggest superstition," Watson said, his voice warm yet pragmatic. "But we will keep an eye out for any unusual behavior." Holmes's lips twitched into a faint smile. "Indeed, Watson. But it is the facts, as always, that will guide us. Let's see what else this museum has to offer." As the two men moved away from the professor, their minds were already turning. Something was afoot in the museum. Holmes could feel it in the very air, the quiet tension, the strange discomfort that clung to the place like a veil. This would not be an ordinary case, and whatever secret the Golden Lion held, Holmes was determined to uncover it. The next morning, the museum's main exhibit hall had an air of uneasy anticipation, as though it itself were holding its breath. Holmes and Watson entered the space, their footsteps silent on the soft rug that lined the floor beneath the exhibit's grand display cases. The soft glow from the overhead lights caught the gleam of the golden lion's golden surface from the distance, its polished fur catching the light like a beacon that promised mystery. Holmes surveyed the room with his usual intensity, his gaze lingering on the people who surrounded the exhibit. Several wealthy patrons, including Lady Eleanor, stood nearby, admiring the artifact with a mix of curiosity and something more, perhaps a bit of fear, or perhaps greed. They were an eclectic group, scholars, collectors, and aristocrats, all drawn together by the promise of seeing the mysterious relic up close. Watson's eyes swept over the crowd, noting the variety of personalities. Among the most striking was Lady Eleanor. Tall, poised, and with an air of wealth that could not be hidden even in the muted tones of her modest dress, she was the first to notice their approach. Her eyes gleamed, as though she had been expecting them. "Doctor, Watson, Mr. Holmes," she greeted, her voice smooth and cultured, with just a hint of condescension. "I trust you're finding the exhibition to your liking?" Holmes gave her a sharp, scrutinizing look. He had already heard whispers about Lady Eleanor, whispers that suggested she was not merely a patron of the museum, but someone with much greater involvement in the world of rare artifacts. However, Holmes was a man of observation, and it was only when he allowed himself the luxury of careful study that her true nature could be revealed. "I have yet to fully explore Lady Eleanor," Holmes replied coolly, his voice calm and measured. "But I must admit, This particular artifact piques my interest more than most." She gave a faint smile, one that seemed almost rehearsed. "Ah, the golden lion. Quite an enigma, isn't it?" She leaned in slightly, her tone lowering as if sharing a secret. "Some believe it holds untold power. A curse, some say." Holmes raised an eyebrow at her words, though his face remained unreadable. "Indeed," he said, his voice steady. "But curses are, as you know, nothing more than fabrications, superstition bred from ignorance." Lady Eleanor's smile widened, but her eyes held a subtle gleam of something darker. "Perhaps. But perhaps the fabrications are more intriguing than the truth. Have you ever wondered, Mr. Holmes, if the truth is not as valuable as the mystery it hides?" Before Holmes could respond, a new voice interjected, low and clipped. "Pardon my intrusion." The man who spoke was tall, with dark hair and a sharp gaze that flickered from Holmes to Lady Eleanor. He wore a meticulously tailored suit, his collar turned just slightly too stiff, as though it were meant to convey a sense of superiority. "Mr. Hale," Lady Eleanor greeted him with a cool nod, her tone shifting slightly, as if the moment had passed for pleasantries. "How are you today?" "I'm well enough," Hale replied, offering a brief, distracted smile before turning his attention to Holmes. "I trust the museum has met your expectations, Mr. Holmes. I'm sure you've seen your fair share of wonders." "I've seen a great deal, Mr. Hale," Holmes replied, his tone neutral. "But the value of something does not lie in its appearance, but in its true nature." Hale's lips quirked upward in a small, knowing smile. "Ah, the detective's perspective. Always seeking what lies beneath the surface, I suppose." Holmes studied Hale, noting the subtle defensiveness in his posture. There was something about the man that rubbed Holmes the wrong way, a sense of arrogance, but also of hidden depths. As he observed, Hale seemed to grow increasingly uncomfortable, his hands twitching slightly at his sides. "If you'll excuse me, I must speak with the professor," Hale said quickly, before striding off toward Professor Williams, who had appeared on the other side of the hall, looking equally out of place amidst the polished glass and ancient relics. Holmes watched Hale's departure, his eyes narrowing in thought. Watson, noticing the look on Holmes's face, leaned in slightly. "What do you make of him?" Holmes didn't respond immediately. Instead, he took a step closer to the display case, his fingers brushing lightly against the cool glass. "There is more to Mr. Hale than meets the eye. He knows something. I'm certain of it." As Holmes continued to study the room, his attention was drawn again to Lady Eleanor, who had not taken her eyes off him. Her presence was oddly magnetic, as though she were more than just a wealthy socialite. In fact, Holmes suspected she had more than a casual interest in the Golden Lion. "The lion seems to hold more power than we give it credit for," Lady Eleanor said, her tone suddenly more serious. "Not just in the stories, but in the people it draws to it." Holmes turned to face her, sensing that she was veering towards something deeper. "Is that so?" She gave a soft laugh, one that was more controlled than amused. "Perhaps," she said, then glanced over at Hale and the professor. "Some people are drawn to objects for reasons they'd rather not discuss. There's a sort of ownership that comes with possessing something like the Golden Lion, and I suspect that some would go to great lengths to claim it as their own." Holmes met her gaze with a piercing look, his mind whirring. "Indeed," he murmured, his voice almost lost beneath the weight of the implication. "And what lengths do you think some would go to, Lady Eleanor?" Before she could answer, there was a sudden shift in the atmosphere. The hum of conversation fell into silence as a new figure entered the room. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and moved with a quiet, almost unnerving grace. His uniform identified him immediately as Gregory, the security officer who had been assigned to the museum that day. Gregory's eyes scanned the room as though he were searching for something, or someone. His gaze passed over the various patrons and staff before landing on Holmes. His eyes narrowed slightly, but his expression remained unreadable. Lady Eleanor's demeanour shifted ever so slightly, and Holmes noticed that the subtle unease she had been trying to hide earlier seemed to return. She gave a brief nod toward Gregory, who acknowledged her with a stiff, curt gesture before moving toward the back of the room. "Ah," Watson remarked quietly. "A man of few words." Holmes nodded but said nothing, his thoughts racing. There was more to Gregory than simply his position in the museum, and it was becoming increasingly clear that every person in this room was hiding something, whether consciously or unconsciously. As the room buzzed with quiet conversations, Holmes allowed himself a moment to observe the small details. Each individual was a piece of a much larger puzzle, and it was only a matter of time before the pieces began to fit together. The morning had worn on, the sun's light filtering through the tall windows of the museum, casting a serene glow over the exhibits, and yet a tension lingered in the air like a storm waiting to break. Holmes and Watson were still discussing the nuances of the Golden Lion and the odd behaviour of its admirers when the calm atmosphere was abruptly shattered. A frantic voice rose above the murmur of the crowd, sharp and terrified. "Professor! The lion! It's gone!" Holmes was the first to react, his instincts honed to perfection. He moved swiftly through the room, his long stride cutting through the stunned onlookers. Watson, ever the loyal companion, followed close behind, his concern palpable as he pushed past the crowd. The two reached Professor Williams, who was standing near the display case, his face ashen, his eyes wide with disbelief. The curator's hands were trembling as they hovered over the now empty pedestal where the golden lion had once been displayed. "Explain, Professor," Holmes demanded in his usual composed manner, though there was an unmistakable intensity in his voice. "What happened?" William's voice was barely a whisper, his words tumbling out in a rush. I don't know. It was just here moments ago. The case. It was locked. No one could have taken it without leaving a trace. But now it's gone." Holmes's eyes swept over the room, scanning the faces of the visitors and staff. There was no sign of panic, not yet, just confusion and uncertainty. It was as if the theft had not yet fully registered in the minds of those present, but the tension was mounting, invisible threads pulling taut. The security officer, Gregory, was the next to approach, his footsteps heavy and measured. He came to a halt beside Holmes, his expression unreadable. "It's true, Mr. Holmes," Gregory said, his voice low. "The lion is gone. The case. It was locked, and the security system was intact until just moments ago. I don't understand. There were no signs of forced entry, and no one left the room." Holmes's gaze flickered toward Gregory, and for a brief moment he caught a glimpse of something off in the officer's demeanour. It was a subtle shift, but Holmes did not miss it. Gregory's eyes darted briefly to the back of the room, toward the corridor leading to the security office, before quickly returning his attention to the group. Holmes was not one to make assumptions based on fleeting observations, but his instincts screamed at him to consider the possibility that Gregory might know more than he was letting on. "Then how do you explain this?" Holmes asked, his voice colder now, as he knelt beside the empty case. His fingers brushed lightly against the edges of the display glass, his mind racing with possibilities. "The lion didn't vanish into thin air, did it?" The professor, still in a daze, shook his head. No, of course not. But I don't know how this happened. The case was secure. There were no signs of tampering. Not until now." Holmes rose to his feet, his gaze fixed on the now vacant pedestal. "The question is not how the lion vanished," he said, his voice cool but laced with a growing intensity. "It is who had the means and the motive to take it, and more importantly, why they would do so." Watson stepped forward, his brow furrowed in concern. "Surely you don't think it's someone from within the museum?" Holmes turned toward him, his expression unreadable. "I think it is highly likely, Watson. For someone to remove such a valuable object without leaving any trace, they must have had intimate knowledge of the museum's security. And someone here, amongst us, must have played a role." The museum staff were starting to gather around, their faces filled with confusion and disbelief. But there was no time for further discussion. Holmes turned to Williams, his eyes piercing. "Where is the security footage? I must see it immediately." Professor Williams swallowed hard, his anxiety now giving way to a frantic urgency. "The security room is just down the hall," he stammered. "But I fear it may be too late. The footage, it seems to have been erased." "Erased?" Holmes repeated, his voice now cold with the weight of suspicion. "This was no mere accident, Professor." As the professor led them down the hall to the security office, the tension in the air thickened. The hum of the fluorescent lights overhead seemed unnaturally loud in the quiet corridor. The smell of dust and old books lingered in the air, mingling with the faint odor of stale coffee that emanated from the security room. Holmes's eyes narrowed as he pushed open the door, his senses alive to every detail in the room. The monitors were all dark, a stark contrast to the usual hum of activity that accompanied a functioning surveillance system. The security officer, Gregory, stepped forward hesitantly, his hands resting on the console. It's as though the footage just disappeared, Mr. Holmes. There should have been recordings of the last few hours, but..." Holmes stepped into the room, his keen gaze flicking over the various buttons and screens. His mind raced, the pieces of the puzzle starting to fall into place. The missing footage, the strange behavior of Gregory, the professor's mounting anxiety, it all pointed towards something much more sinister than a simple theft. "This is no coincidence," Holmes muttered to himself. He moved toward the console, his hands working deftly over the equipment. Whoever took the Golden Lion knew exactly what they were doing. They've covered their tracks very well. As Holmes examined the security equipment, his mind began to piece together the growing mystery. The theft was no random act, no opportunity taken by an opportunistic thief. The Golden Lion had been targeted, and the theft had been orchestrated with careful precision. "Someone here is involved," Holmes said quietly, turning to Gregory, his gaze sharp. "And I intend to find out who." Before anyone could respond, a shrill sound cut through the tension. The unmistakable ring of a telephone, breaking the eerie silence of the room. Holmes's eyes flicked toward the phone, and the sense of dread in the air seemed to deepen. This was just the beginning. The telephone's shrill ring echoed through the otherwise quiet room, cutting through the thick silence like a knife. Holmes's sharp gaze flicked towards the receiver, but it was Gregory, still standing near the console, who answered the call. His voice, though low, carried the unmistakable edge of unease. Yes, this is Gregory," he murmured, his tone too hurried. "What's that?" No, nothing unusual." "Right. I'll be there shortly." He hung up quickly, his hand trembling as he replaced the receiver. Holmes noted the man's discomfort, the flush of nervousness that crept up his neck. It was a small detail, but it did not escape the detective's scrutiny. Gregory's face had betrayed more than he would have liked. "Mr. Holmes," Gregory began, his voice now more clipped. I must leave. There's a situation in the lower level, near the vaults. We're having an issue with security." He cleared his throat, avoiding Holmes's gaze. Holmes did not react immediately. Instead, he turned his attention back to the security panel, his eyes scanning the darkened screens once more. It was clear to him now. The theft had been well coordinated, and it had been timed with precision. Gregory's sudden need to leave felt far too convenient. "Of course," Holmes said finally, his tone deceptively smooth. "I trust you'll handle the situation in the vaults, Mr. Gregory. But before you go, might I ask you to remain for just a moment longer? I have some questions regarding the security footage." Gregory stiffened, but there was no immediate answer. He shifted on his feet, clearly torn between his duties and the increasingly sharp gaze of Holmes. "Perhaps," Holmes continued, his voice still calm, but there was an unmistakable steel beneath the surface. "It would be prudent for you to answer a few questions first. After all, the thief could be among us." The room seemed to freeze at his words. Even Williams, who had been silently wringing his hands, looked up at the suggestion. It was subtle, but the change in Gregory's posture was unmistakable. He was now visibly on edge, his lips tightening into a thin line. "I don't know what you mean," Gregory muttered, his eyes darting to the door. Holmes's gaze held steady, unwavering. "I believe you do, Mr. Gregory. You see, there's something peculiar about your behavior. I'm sure you understand that your reluctance to assist could only cast further suspicion on your role in this affair." Gregory's expression hardened, though his hands still shook. "I have nothing to do with this," he snapped, his voice betraying his nerves. "I've already told you, I don't know how the footage was erased, and now I'm needed elsewhere." Holmes stepped closer, his figure imposing. "You were here at the time of the theft, were you not? You had access to the security equipment. A man in your position would know how to erase the footage, would he not?" For a moment, Gregory said nothing. His eyes flickered toward the door, but there was no escape. Not from Holmes. The detective's presence was like a weight, pressing in on him, and it was clear Gregory was beginning to buckle under the scrutiny. "I've done nothing wrong," Gregory muttered under his breath, his voice barely audible. "I've been doing my job, keeping an eye on the museum like I'm supposed to." Holmes did not respond immediately, instead turning his attention to the rest of the room. Watson, who had been quiet up until now, was eyeing the scene with a mixture of concern and curiosity. The exchange was becoming increasingly tense, and the atmosphere in the small, dimly lit security room was thick with unease. "Perhaps, Mr. Gregory," Holmes said, his voice now quieter, almost conversational, "it would be prudent to go over your movements last night. When exactly did you leave the room? Did anyone enter or leave during your shift? Can you remember the times the staff accessed the vaults?" Gregory looked cornered now, the weight of Holmes's interrogation pressing down on him. "I don't know. I was—" He faltered, and for the briefest moment, his composure cracked, revealing something darker, something hidden. I was near the vaults, but I didn't—" At that, there was a loud thud from the hall, and all heads turned toward the door. A figure appeared in the doorway, breathless and wide-eyed. It was one of the museum's junior staff, a young woman by the name of Marjorie. "Mr. Holmes!" she exclaimed, her voice panicked. "Professor Williams! He's gone. I can't find him anywhere. His office is locked, and the door to the vault is ajar." Holmes's eyes narrowed immediately. This was the moment. The missing professor. The open door. The story was unraveling before them, and it was becoming clear that nothing about this case was as simple as it seemed. "Where is the professor now?" Holmes asked, his voice sharp with urgency. "I don't know," Marjorie replied, her voice trembling. "He was there just before I went to the office. I thought he was just busy, but when I went back, he was gone." Holmes stood motionless for a moment, considering the information. His mind was racing, rapidly processing the new developments. He could feel the tension thickening in the room. "You've done well to inform us, Marjorie," Holmes said, his voice taking on its usual cool tone. "Now, we must move quickly. Watson, let's head to the professor's office. Mr. Gregory, if you'd be so kind as to accompany us, perhaps you can shed some light on this new development." Gregory stiffened at the suggestion, but the look Holmes gave him was unyielding, and the security officer, reluctantly, nodded his agreement. The hallways of the museum felt eerily quiet as Holmes, Watson, and Gregory made their way toward the professor's office. The usual hum of activity had been replaced by a heavy silence, the kind that precedes a storm. The walls, lined with ancient artifacts, seemed to close in around them as they walked, their footsteps echoing through the narrow corridor. Gregory led the way, his expression tight, and though he remained silent, Holmes could sense the unease radiating off the man. It wasn't just the theft that troubled him. It was something more, something hidden beneath the surface. Holmes had caught the brief flicker of fear in Gregory's eyes back in the security room, and now it was impossible to ignore the weight of his guilt, though whether he was guilty of complicity or something more was yet to be determined. As they reached the professor's office, Gregory hesitated, his hand hovering uncertainly over the door handle. It was as if he feared what they might find inside, as if the office itself had become a trap. "Open it, Gregory," Holmes commanded, his voice low but unwavering. He stepped forward, his sharp eyes never leaving the officer, who slowly turned the handle. The door creaked open, revealing the dimly lit interior of the professor's study. The room was small, cluttered with papers, stacks of books, and shelves lined with historical texts and museum records. But what caught Holmes's attention immediately was the desk, unmistakably disturbed, papers scattered across the surface as though someone had hastily searched through them. The room felt oddly still, as though it had been frozen in time. "It appears someone was looking for something," Watson remarked, stepping closer to the desk. His eyes scanned the disarray, noting the papers that had been hastily thrown aside. There was a faint odour of ink and dust in the air, and Holmes could almost taste the tension that hung in the room. "Indeed," Holmes replied, his voice soft but laden with thought. He bent down to inspect a torn document near the edge of the desk, his gloved fingers brushing against the paper. It was an old map, yellowed with age, its edges frayed as though it had been handled many times. The map depicted the museum, but there were markings on it, symbols and locations that seemed to correspond to certain rooms and artifacts, including the Golden Lion. "This," Holmes murmured, "is very interesting. It seems our professor had more than a passing interest in the Golden Lion." Gregory shifted uncomfortably at the mention of the artifact, his hands twitching at his sides. "I don't know anything about that," he muttered, his voice tight. "The professor was always secretive. He had his own affairs. I never questioned him." Holmes straightened, his eyes narrowing as he turned his gaze back to Gregory. "And yet, you were the one who suggested I speak to him, weren't you, Gregory? You're quite familiar with his affairs." Gregory stiffened at the accusation, his gaze flickering nervously. I was just trying to help," he stammered, though the defensive tone in his voice only deepened Holmes's suspicion. "I didn't know what he was up to. He was always involved in strange dealings, artifacts and relics that weren't exactly legal." The weight of Gregory's words hung in the air, and Holmes's mind raced. There was no question now that Gregory had more knowledge of the professor's actions than he was letting on. But whether that made him complicit in the theft, or merely a bystander, was still unclear. "I see," Holmes said slowly, his eyes piercing into Gregory's. "And did you ever find out exactly what he was searching for?" Gregory hesitated, his eyes flickering toward the disordered desk. I don't know. He was obsessed with the Golden Lion, I know that much. He kept talking about its curse, and how he was trying to uncover its true origins. But nothing made sense. He was always so cryptic." Watson exchanged a look with Holmes, but Holmes didn't respond immediately. Instead, he turned his attention back to the scattered papers. There was a growing sense of urgency now, the pieces of the puzzle starting to fall into place. The professor's obsession with the artifact, the strange map, and Gregory's involvement all pointed to something deeper, a connection between the stolen Golden Lion and whatever secret the professor had been hiding. Holmes picked up a leather-bound notebook that had been discarded on the desk, flipping through its pages with deliberate care. His eyes scanned the writing, small, meticulous notes detailing the professor's research into ancient artifacts, myths, and curses. But it was the last entry that caught Holmes's attention. The professor had written about a key that could unlock the truth behind the Golden Lion's mystery. There was no further explanation, just a series of cryptic symbols and phrases that made no immediate sense. "This is more than just a theft," Holmes muttered, more to himself than anyone else. He closed the notebook, his mind racing to connect the dots. Someone is after something far more valuable than the lion itself. This key, it's the key to something much larger. Watson leaned in, his voice hushed. "Do you think the professor knew what it was? Could he have discovered something that others are willing to kill for?" Holmes's gaze was distant, his mind fully consumed by the case. "I believe so, Watson, and I believe he may have paid the price for it." A sudden sharp noise broke the tension, a faint sound coming from the hallway outside the office. Holmes's eyes darted to the door, his senses immediately alert. Someone was approaching. The unmistakable sound of hurried footsteps echoed in the corridor, growing louder with each passing second. Before Holmes could react, the door swung open with a force that startled both him and Watson. In the doorway stood Lady Eleanor, her face pale and strained, her breath coming in quick, shallow bursts. "Mr. Holmes," she said urgently, her voice trembling, "you must come quickly. There's been another incident. The vault door, it's been opened." Holmes stood up straight, his mind immediately shifting gears. There was no time to waste. "Lead the way, Lady Eleanor," Holmes said, his voice steady, though his pulse quickened. The web of deceit had grown tighter, and it seemed that every step they took only led them deeper into a labyrinth of secrets. The air in the museum's vaults was cooler than the rest of the building, a lingering chill that seemed to seep into the bones. Holmes could feel the weight of the stone walls pressing in on him, and the faint scent of old wood and metal lingered in the dimly lit space. Lady Eleanor led the way through the narrow corridor that connected the main vault to the deeper chambers, her heels clicking sharply on the stone floor. Holmes and Watson followed closely behind, their footsteps muffled by the thick carpet of dust that had settled over the years. The vault door was ajar, its massive iron frame slightly tilted, as though it had been hastily opened. Holmes's sharp eyes immediately noticed the absence of the security lock that should have been in place, a lock that had been checked and double-checked by the museum's staff in preparation for the Golden Lion's display. It was gone, the mechanism manipulated with a precision that suggested insider knowledge. Holmes stepped forward, his mind already processing the details. The vault itself was a cavernous space, filled with rows of ancient relics, each one encased in glass or secured behind iron bars. The Golden Lion, of course, was no longer among them, its absence leaving an eerie void where it had once rested. But it wasn't the missing lion that caught Holmes's attention now. No, it was the faint, almost imperceptible trace of something else, something recent. "Watson," Holmes said softly, his gaze scanning the room. "Do you see it?" Watson, ever observant, followed Holmes's line of sight, his brow furrowing. "I see it," he replied, his voice a mixture of confusion and intrigue. "There's a disturbance in the dust, as though someone's been moving things." Holmes nodded, his eyes narrowing. "Exactly. This vault has been tampered with recently. The dust has been displaced here and there, strategically, almost as if someone knew exactly where to look." They approached the closest display case, and Holmes crouched down to inspect it closely. The lock had been broken, and inside, the space where a priceless artifact had once been was empty. The sight was unsettling, and the realization began to settle over Holmes. This theft was not a random act of opportunity. No, this was a calculated, deliberate move, one that had been carefully planned and executed by someone with intimate knowledge of the museum's layout and security. Lady Eleanor, who had been watching quietly from the doorway, stepped forward now, her voice soft but filled with barely contained anxiety. "What does this mean, Mr. Holmes? If the lion isn't here, then where is it? Who would do this?" Holmes stood up slowly, his mind spinning with the implications of what he had uncovered. "The lion is only part of the puzzle," he said, his voice steady, but his mind clearly working at a rapid pace. "There is more at play here, Lady Eleanor. Whoever took it knew what they were doing, knew where to find it, and perhaps more importantly, why it was valuable." She swallowed visibly, her lips pressed tightly together, as if trying to control the unease rising within her. "But why the vault? Why not just take the lion directly?" Holmes looked at her sharply, his gaze intense. "That is precisely the question we need to answer." There was a pause, a moment where the only sound was the soft rustling of papers and the occasional creak of the building settling. Holmes's mind was racing now, and the pieces were beginning to fall into place, though he had not yet drawn all the necessary conclusions. He turned to Gregory, who had followed them into the vault, his face unreadable. "You were the one who managed the vault security," Holmes said, his tone almost conversational. "Did you notice anything unusual in the days leading up to the theft?" Gregory's face shifted slightly, a flicker of hesitation passing over his features before he spoke. No, nothing that stood out. Everything seemed normal. The security was checked regularly. No signs of forced entry. Holmes's gaze hardened, and he leaned in just slightly, his voice lowering. "And yet the security measures were bypassed with ease, Mr. Gregory. You don't find that odd?" Gregory's jaw clenched, and for a moment, he seemed at a loss for words. I don't know," he muttered. "I swear I had nothing to do with it. I was just doing my job." Holmes studied the officer for a long moment before turning away. He had learned enough for now. Gregory's involvement was still unclear, but the growing tension between the man and the theft was becoming harder to ignore. He seemed too defensive, too eager to disassociate himself from the scene. There was something he wasn't saying, something that didn't sit right with Holmes. As Holmes's eyes roamed the vault, something else caught his attention. It was subtle, almost imperceptible at first. A faint smear of dark liquid on the edge of one of the display cases. His fingers brushed against the surface, and he could feel the coldness of it, the slick texture. It was blood, and though the trace was faint, it was enough to make Holmes pause, his mind immediately jumping to the implications. "Lady Eleanor," Holmes said quietly, his voice steady despite the sudden urgency. "Would you be so kind as to wait outside? This may take a while longer." She looked at him with wide eyes but nodded. "Of course, Mr. Holmes. But is it safe?" Holmes did not immediately answer. Instead, he continued to study the scene, his mind working furiously. Blood, whether it was a clue or a red herring, had its own story to tell, and it was a story that was beginning to unfold with disturbing clarity. Someone had been injured during the theft, and that injury had likely been a part of the plan. But who? When Lady Eleanor had left the vault, Holmes moved closer to the bloodstain, kneeling down to examine it more closely. Watson, standing nearby, noticed the grim expression on Holmes's face. "What are you thinking, Holmes?" Watson asked, his voice soft, but filled with a growing sense of concern. Holmes didn't immediately respond. He was deep in thought, his brow furrowed as he pieced together the subtle clues. The blood wasn't a sign of a struggle, not exactly. It was too controlled, too calculated, as if it had been spilled deliberately to mislead, to create a false narrative. He stood up, the pieces of the puzzle beginning to fit together in a way that unsettled him. There was more to this case than he had imagined, far more, and the threads were leading him toward an unexpected conclusion. The air in the vault felt colder now, more oppressive. Holmes's mind buzzed with activity, each thought connecting to the next with increasing clarity. The bloodstain, faint as it was, and the increasingly suspicious behavior of Gregory, it all pointed to a conspiracy that was beginning to take shape, though the full picture remained elusive. He stood at the center of the vault, his gaze sweeping over the disarray of the room. The golden lion was gone, the vault tampered with, and the cryptic map from the professor's desk lingering in his mind. The puzzle pieces had begun to assemble, but there was something still missing, some crucial detail that hovered just beyond his reach. "I believe we are dealing with something far more intricate than a simple theft, Watson," Holmes muttered, his voice low but sharp. "This is not a random act. Someone is orchestrating events, manipulating everyone around them." Watson, who had been standing near the entrance, watching Holmes as his mind churned through the information, stepped closer. "You think someone's been pulling the strings all along? But how? And why?" Holmes didn't answer immediately. Instead, he turned toward the display case where the golden lion had once rested. His eyes narrowed as he examined the position of the case, slightly shifted from its original place, and the small traces of dust that had been disturbed. Nothing about this theft had been spontaneous. This was a deliberate act, a series of calculated movements designed to mislead and confuse. "There is a reason why the Golden Lion was chosen," Holmes continued, his thoughts almost becoming audible as he spoke. "It's not just the curse that attracted attention. No, there's something deeper. Something about the artifact's history that makes it so valuable to certain individuals." Holmes turned to Watson, his eyes gleaming with the excitement of discovery. "The key, Watson. The professor's notes about the key. It is not merely an object to unlock a door. It's a symbol, a metaphorical key to something far more dangerous." Watson frowned, his brow furrowed in confusion. "A key? But we've seen no evidence of such an object. Surely you don't mean the map?" Holmes nodded slowly, his gaze never leaving Watson. "Precisely. The map marks certain areas of the museum, but it is not only the physical spaces it highlights that matter. It's the places it doesn't mark, the hidden spaces, the forgotten parts of this building. I believe the Golden Lion was the catalyst, but there is something deeper at play here. The key is not an object we can hold. It's something buried within the very foundation of this museum." Watson stood silent for a moment, digesting this new theory. Holmes's deductions were often difficult to follow at first, but in time the connections always became clear. Yet this theory was different, more abstract, more elusive. Watson had to admit that he didn't fully understand, but he trusted Holmes. Always. Holmes walked toward the far corner of the vault, his boots echoing softly as he moved. His eyes scanned the room once more, his mind piecing together the small details, the hidden clues that others would overlook. The bloodstain, the strange behavior of Gregory, the professor's obsession with the lion, it all pointed to something far bigger than a stolen artifact. "The vault itself," Holmes said suddenly, his voice rising with excitement. "It is not just a secure room for storing valuable items. It is a holding place, a secret. We are looking at a game of misdirection. Whoever is behind this theft has played us all for fools, leading us to focus on the Golden Lion while they make their real move." Watson felt a chill run down his spine as Holmes's words began to sink in. It was not just the Golden Lion that had been stolen. It was something far more valuable. Something hidden beneath the surface. Something that only a select few would know how to find. Holmes's eyes were alight now, his mind in overdrive as the pieces of the puzzle came together in startling clarity. The professor was the key player in all of this. He knew what the Golden Lion truly represented. The curse wasn't the artifact itself, it was the power it had over those who sought it. "But why would someone go to such lengths to steal the lion?" Watson asked, his voice filled with the weight of confusion. "What is it about this artifact that could cause such obsession?" Holmes paced the length of the vault, his fingers trailing lightly along the edge of a display case as he spoke, his voice soft, but filled with the certainty that came only from years of experience. "It's not the lion itself, Watson. It's what the lion represents, the knowledge hidden within it, the key to an ancient secret." The professor had uncovered something that would unlock a door to a forgotten history. A history that, once revealed, would give immense power to whoever controls it. Watson took a step forward, his eyes narrowing with a sudden realization. "And the thief? Who is it?" Holmes stopped in his tracks, turning slowly to face Watson, his eyes gleaming with the intensity of his conclusion. "That, my friend, is where the true mystery lies. The thief is not just a criminal. They are someone with a far more personal stake in this. Someone who has been hiding in plain sight." Holmes's words hung in the air, and the silence that followed was thick with tension. Watson's mind raced, trying to make sense of Holmes's theory. The thief wasn't a random opportunist. They were someone who knew the museum inside out, who understood the power of the Golden Lion and its connection to something far more dangerous. Holmes's voice broke the silence once more, but this time it was softer, filled with the gravity of his final realization. The professor knew too much. And for that, he paid the price. The thief is not a stranger to this museum, Watson. They are someone with ties to its very foundation. Watson's heart skipped a beat as the realization hit him. Gregory, he whispered, his voice barely audible. Holmes's eyes flicked toward the door, where the shadow of Gregory loomed. Yes, Watson. Gregory. The vault door creaked as it swung open, and the dim light from the hallway flooded the room, casting long shadows across the stone floor. Holmes and Watson stood in the doorway, their figures framed against the harsh light of the corridor. The air in the vault seemed to shift, the atmosphere thick with the weight of impending truth. Holmes could feel the tension in the air, like a taut string pulled just before the snap. The thief was close, and this was the moment when everything would be revealed. Gregory was standing near the far wall, his back to them, as if trying to avoid their gaze. He hadn't expected them to return so soon, not after the dramatic turn their investigation had taken. Holmes could see the flicker of anxiety in his posture, the way his hands clenched into fists at his sides. The time for subtlety was over. Gregory, Holmes said, his voice cold and steady, carrying the weight of certainty. The word cut through the silence like a blade, and Gregory stiffened. Watson stepped forward, his gaze fixed on the security officer. We know it was you, he said, his voice firm but laced with disbelief. We know about the bloodstain, the locked vault, the missing lion. You've been hiding in plain sight. Gregory's back stiffened at the accusation, but he did not turn to face them immediately. His breath quickened, a faint tremor in his hands betraying the calm facade he tried to maintain. I didn't. His voice faltered as he finally faced them, his eyes wide with panic. I didn't want this. I didn't want to be involved. But I had no choice. You don't understand. Holmes stepped closer, his gaze fixed, unwavering. No choice, Gregory. You always had a choice, but you chose to sell out your integrity, your loyalty to this museum, and to everyone who trusted you. For what? Power? Wealth? What is it that you think the Golden Lion offers you? Gregory's eyes darted to the floor, his expression hardening. The struggle inside him was visible now, and for the first time, Holmes saw a glimpse of the man's true fear. Fear not of being caught, but of what might happen when the truth was exposed. The lion wasn't just an artifact, Gregory muttered, his voice low. It was a key to something far greater. It could have opened doors that would change everything. I couldn't let that power slip through my fingers. Holmes's mind worked quickly, connecting the last dots. He could feel the pieces of the mystery falling into place. So you knew the professor had found it, he said, his voice sharp. He uncovered the truth behind the Golden Lion, and you sought to control it. But you weren't the only one who had that ambition. Gregory clenched his jaw, his fists trembling at his sides. No, you don't understand. The professor, he was too obsessed with the curse. He didn't see what was right in front of him. He couldn't see that the lion was the key to unlocking everything. There were people who would do anything to have it. There was a pause as Holmes processed this new revelation. It was clear now that Gregory had been more than just an accomplice. He had been a player in a far more dangerous game. He wasn't acting alone, and the stakes had escalated far beyond a simple theft. The Golden Lion wasn't just valuable, it was the linchpin of a much larger conspiracy. Holmes's eyes narrowed. Who are these people, Gregory? Who is pulling your strings? Gregory's lips trembled, his gaze flickering toward the far corner of the room, as if searching for an escape, but finding none. His voice dropped to a whisper. I can't say. They'll kill me if I do. Holmes stepped forward, his presence looming over Gregory. You've already made your choices, Gregory. You're not getting out of this, not without answers. Who is behind this? Who else is involved? Gregory's eyes darted toward the door, then back to Holmes, the panic in his eyes growing. He took a sharp breath, his hands gripping his sides. I don't know their names. They were shadowy figures. The professor was too close to discovering the truth. I had to stop him, had to keep him from revealing everything. I didn't mean for anyone to die. I never wanted this. Holmes stepped back, his eyes still trained on Gregory, now with a hint of pity. The man was broken, consumed by his own choices, and it was clear now that Gregory wasn't the mastermind. He was merely a pawn, caught in a web far too intricate for him to escape. "That's where you went wrong," Holmes said quietly, his voice soft with a touch of regret. "You never saw the bigger picture. You were so focused on the power the Golden Lion promised that you failed to realize the true cost." Gregory's eyes were glassy now, his shoulders slumped in defeat. "I thought it was just a myth. I thought I could control it, control the power. But now it's all falling apart." Holmes stood in silence for a moment, his mind racing through the possibilities. The pieces of the puzzle were coming together, but the true scale of the conspiracy was still shrouded in darkness. Someone else was pulling the strings, someone more dangerous than Gregory could ever be. The Golden Lion was a mere stepping stone, an artifact to unlock something far more terrifying. "Tell me, Gregory," Holmes said softly, his voice grave. "Where is the lion now?" Gregory shook his head, his voice cracking. "I don't know. I wasn't the one who took it. I was just supposed to make sure the professor didn't find out too much. I didn't know it would come to this." Holmes exhaled slowly, his eyes narrowing with growing certainty. Gregory wasn't the mastermind, but he was a key piece of the puzzle. The true mastermind was still out there, and the danger was far from over. Holmes's mind worked furiously as he considered their next move. There was still so much to uncover, so much left to reveal. But one thing was clear. The lion's curse was real, and the truth it held was far more dangerous than anyone had anticipated. "I'll find them, Gregory," Holmes said, his voice cold and resolute. "I'll find the ones who are behind this, and I'll make sure they pay for what they've done." The museum was quiet now, the soft murmur of the crowd replaced by the heavy silence that lingered in the aftermath of the revelation. Holmes stood near the exit, his coat sweeping behind him as he surveyed the now peaceful halls of the museum. The golden glow of the lamps cast long shadows across the marble floors, the place once again feeling like a tomb to the secrets it held. He had solved the case, unraveled the tangled web of deceit and danger, but it was a hollow victory. There was no satisfaction in bringing the thief to justice, not when the cost had been so high. Watson walked beside him, his face etched with a mixture of relief and weariness. The detective's mind, as always, was a whirlwind of thoughts, but Watson knew better than to interrupt. They had seen their share of cases, some simple, some far more complex, but this one had weighed on them both in ways they hadn't expected. The professor's death, the conspiracy, the lies. It had all been darker than Holmes had anticipated when they first entered the museum. "Holmes," Watson began, his voice low, "do you feel any differently about it? About what we've uncovered?" Holmes didn't answer immediately. He stopped in front of a display case, his gaze fixed on the artifacts within. It was a faint smile that tugged at the corner of his lips, but it wasn't one of triumph. More a reflection of the exhaustion that had settled over him like a shadow. "Do I feel differently?" Holmes repeated, as if weighing the words. He exhaled slowly, running a hand over his face. "I don't know, Watson. I suppose I've grown used to solving the puzzles. It's the nature of the work, after all. But some cases, well, they leave a mark. And this one felt different." Watson watched him carefully, sensing the layers of doubt that Holmes rarely allowed anyone to see. It wasn't just the case that haunted him. It was the human cost of it, the lives caught in the wake of the Golden Lion and its curse, the lives lost, the people manipulated. "The professor," Holmes continued, his voice quieter now, "wasn't just a victim of the theft. He was a man consumed by something he couldn't escape, an obsession with a myth, a power that could have destroyed him. And in the end it did. Watson said softly, his voice heavy with the weight of the words. Holmes nodded. Yes. He thought the lion would unlock the truth. But in the end, it was the truth that killed him. The silence between them grew as they walked toward the exit. Holmes had been quiet, introspective, and Watson could sense the shift in him. The detective had always been driven by logic, by the need to solve mysteries, to uncover the hidden truths. But this case, this tangle of lies and betrayal, had shaken him in ways he hadn't anticipated. As they reached the museum's grand entrance, Holmes turned to Watson, his expression softer now, though the usual sharpness remained in his eyes. I've often wondered, Watson, Holmes said, his voice quiet, what happens after the case is solved? Once the puzzle is complete, what do we have left? Watson looked at him, considering the question carefully. He knew that for Holmes, solving a case wasn't just about revealing the truth. It was about something deeper, something that drove him to continue searching for the next mystery. And yet, as much as Holmes craved answers, he often seemed unsatisfied by them. It was the chase that fueled him, not necessarily the resolution. I suppose, Watson began, we have what we always have, Holmes. We have the knowledge that we've done our part, that we've solved the mystery, uncovered the truth, and brought justice where it was due. But we also have the reminder that the world is far more complicated than we think. Holmes's gaze softened for a moment, and he gave a slight nod. It was as close to an acknowledgement of gratitude as Watson would likely get from him. And in that moment, Watson understood. No matter how many cases they solved, no matter how many truths they uncovered, Holmes would always remain the man who searched for answers, even when the answers left him more empty than fulfilled. As they exited the museum, the cool night air greeted them, the faint breeze ruffling their coats. Holmes paused for a moment, looking up at the darkening sky. The world beyond the museum was quiet, but for Holmes, it was never truly quiet. His mind was always working, always searching for the next case, the next puzzle to solve. Watson placed a hand on his shoulder, offering a quiet comfort. Whatever comes next, Holmes, we'll face it together. Holmes didn't respond immediately. He merely stood there, his gaze fixed on the horizon, as if seeing something far beyond the physical world around him. And then, after a moment, he nodded once again, the barest hint of a smile tugging at his lips. Yes, Holmes said softly, almost to himself. Together. With that, the two men walked off into the night, the mystery of the Golden Lion finally laid to rest, but the knowledge that there would always be another, waiting just beyond the horizon, hung in the air like an unspoken promise.